Hello and welcome to episode 49 of A Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. My name is Ed Hill. So if you're tuning in again to listen, thanks very much for coming back, and I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. If you're new to the podcast, basically to explain, it revolves around the topic of the journals written by my great-great-grandfather William Mowbray Scott as a early steam engineer in the 1840s, travelling around the world, using his skill and expertise to make a living, primarily in Italy, where he works on a very early railway, and then later in Mexico, where he's employed in the mint or the coin-making industry there, which is also heavily aligned with the silver mining industry there as well. There's lots of episodes to catch up on, so you can follow William and his travels from London down to Milan and back again, and then across the Atlantic to Mexico. Just to say to anyone who wants to make contact with me or wants to discuss anything or has any observations about the podcast and about the episodes or what they've listened to, the best way to do that is through the social media channels. So there's a X account, which is Scott of the Historic, and that's at 3G Grand Tour. So that's at the number 3G Grand Tour. That's Scott of the Historic. And there's also a Facebook page, which is at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. And there's a Blue Sky account, which is Scott's Grand Tour at bsky.social. Or Ed Hill, you can use that to search for it as well. The podcast is available on pretty well all podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, etc., and all the others that are around. So you can catch all the episodes that way. If you do want to contact me about something that I've said or spoken about on the podcasts, it's always great to hear from someone, particularly if they've got a particular interest in something or they know more about a subject than I do. I'm not a professional historian, so I'm just doing the research into the things that William talks about and discusses myself. So if you've got a particular area of expertise that you'd like to comment about and correct me on, by all means go ahead. It's always great to get feedback. So I always begin the episode by reminding ourselves where we were at the last one. So William is travelling on this silver route through Mexico from Veracruz up through Mexico City, and he's got to a place called Aguas Calientes. And so in this next episode, it's quite a significant moment because he's actually going to finally reach Zacatecas, which is where he ends up working in the mint for the next 4 years. So it's been a long journey, mainly by a mixture of coach, horseback, riding on mules, because this is quite rough terrain that they're traversing. But he's finally got there. I just should add that this route is known as the Silver Route because it's the way that the early Spanish settlers established transporting the silver and gold that they were mining from the centre of Mexico to the coast. So it's a well-established route by the time William's riding along it, and quite a lot of the towns and cities along that route are fairly significant because of the wealth that trading in those goods brought to them. Now, in this next episode, William's only a few leagues away from Zacatecas. He's got to a place that he calls Cape Point, which I haven't actually been able to find any reference to at all. So it's probably called something else now. And I've checked the original journals just to make sure I hadn't misquoted what he'd said, but it's definitely Cape Point. But as I say, I haven't been able to find any historic reference to that particular place. But it's only, basically, I think it's only really a small inn and a few buildings. And he's going to spend the next half day travelling to Zacatecas. And that's pretty well where I'll end this episode. But just to say, it's quite an interesting episode. There are quite a few things happening to him. And there's some significant moments. I won't say too much now, but it's certainly a turning point for him, I would say, in his time in Mexico. And of course, an exciting time for him as well, because he's finally got to where he's actually going to start working on the machinery. So I do hope you enjoy it, and we'll join William again now, making his way by mule, I think it is, or horse. I think he manages to get himself a horse rather than a mule, which is a bit more comfortable to ride on these last few steps to Zacatecas. December 26th. On rising this morning, the sun was shining brightly, and on going to the front of the inn, a most noble prospect presented itself. Directly in front, at a distance of 200 yards, was a beautiful lake, probably of 1.5 leagues in breadth, and I understood extending in a length a distance of 10 leagues. Directly behind the inn was a perpendicular cliff, at least 1,000 feet in height, the abrupt termination of a range of mineral mountains, whose summits were impassable, and which extended for nearly 30 leagues across the country, thus rendering this hamlet of Cape Point the only possible passage in a distance of 50 leagues. In front of the inn and betwixt it and the lake was encamped a large body of arrieros, or muleteers, so that's mule drivers, bringing goods from their fair of San Juan de Lagos. There were not less than 1,000 mules quietly feeding out of long wooden troughs, bales of goods of all descriptions placed in long rows on the ground. Numbers of fires were lighted in different parts, surrounded by men taking their morning's repast. The arrieros, or muleteers, who are the only carriers in this country, congregate in great convoys and set off in large and well-armed trains on appointed days, while traditional travellers swell their numbers and contribute to their strength. In this primitive way is the commerce of this country carried on. The muleteer is the general medium of traffic and the legitimate traverser of the land, crossing the Republic from Veracruz to Guadalupe y Calvo, and from San Blas on the Pacific to Tampico on the Gulf of Mexico. He lives frugally and hardily. His bag of coarse cloth holds his scanty stock of provisions, and a leather bottle at his saddle bow containing water for a supply across barren mountains and thirsty plains. A mule cloth spread upon the ground is his bed at night, and a pack saddle his pillow. His low but clean-limbed, sinewy form betokens strength, his complexion dark and sunburnt, his eye resolute, his demeanour is frank, manly and courteous, and he never passes you on the road without a grave salutation of "God guard you" or "God be with you, cavalier." As these men are answerable for any loss or damage occasioned by negligence, they have their weapons always at hand, slung to their saddles, and ready to be snatched out for desperate defence. But their united numbers render them secure against petty bands of marauders and the solitary bandoleros. So that's a bandit on his own, basically. A solitary bandoleros armed to the teeth and mounted on his spirited steed, who hovers about them like a pirate about a merchant convoy, without daring to make an assault. It has a most picturesque effect also to meet a train of muleteers in some mountain pass. First you hear the bells of the leading mules breaking up with their simple melody, the stillness of the airy height, or perhaps the voice of the muleteer admonishing some tardy or wandering animal, or chanting at the full stretch of his lungs some traditional ballad. At length you see the mules slowly winding along the cragged defile, so that's like a narrow gorge, sometimes descending precipitous cliffs, so as to present themselves in full relief against the sky, sometimes toiling up the deep, arid chasm below you. As they approach, you observe their gay decorations of worsted tufts, tassels and saddlecloths, while as they pass by, the ever-ready blunderbuss slung behind the packs and saddles gives a hint of the insecurity of the road. As our own animals showed great fatigue this morning from the effects of the long journey, we did not leave Cape Point till 10 o'clock, this day's ride being only 7 leagues. About a league from Cape Point, we were startled by a noise for which we could not account for some time. It was like the rumbling of distant thunder, and yet accompanied by a trembling of the earth. It was occasioned by a troop of at least 2,000 horses in a half-wild state that were being driven from the pastures up into a large enclosure for the purpose of taking a certain number of them for work. It certainly was a noble sight to see them rushing along, mane and tail erect, and looking as if they could bear down everything before them. The country from Cape Point to Maison de Refugio, which was the extent of this day's journey, is more barren and less cultivated than the former part of the route. Arrived at Maison about 3, which is nothing but a small inn and a few huts, with not the slightest thing in any shape to attract attention. So I'm just going to break in here to say a little bit about these herreras, or muleteers, as William calls them, and actually gives a very good account here of the impression that they gave to him. So I think this is actually a very useful picture of this particular way of how goods were transported around Mexico. Now, the herreros, or muleteer, basically it's a mule driver. They were a common sight throughout New Spain and South America, also quite a common sight in places like Colombia. But in Mexico particularly, because of the rough terrain of the land, these mule trains were the ideal way to transport goods, particularly pre-railways. And the herrero, in a way, became almost a bit of a folk hero, I suppose, of Mexican society, because they were a vital part of its economy. And usually what they would do was they would agree with the producer of whatever goods they were transporting to take them to a fair and then sell them there, or hand them on to someone to be sold there, and then they would bring the money back to the producer, or sometimes they would actually just buy the goods themselves and then take them to the fair and sell them and get the benefit of the money that way. But it's interesting that William describes them. In this instance, nearly 1,000 mules, I think he says, were on view. Mules were particularly chosen because they're very, very hardy animals. They can carry a lot of weight compared to their own weight. They're also hardier than horses, less prone to injury. And because they walk with one foot in front of the other, they're quite good at walking along these narrow passages and narrow pathways. Apparently, there are places in Mexico where you can still see where these original mule tracks were, by the fact that they've been worn down through the centuries of travel. But of course, the thing about them was they became sort of folk heroes because they did, as William says, had to deal with bandits and things like that if they were attacked. I think in this case, he gives a good example of how, obviously, a good way of protecting themselves was strength in numbers. So there's obviously a lot of them all together to keep the bandits at bay. But also they were a source of gossip as well, and news. You know, they told people the news of things happening in other parts of Mexico as they travelled around the country. And they spread songs and their traditions of singing and storytelling with them as well. I've seen a sculpture dedicated to the herreros actually in Colombia, but they were very much part of Mexican society as well. And of course vital at a time when railways were still a long way off, and even in William's time, although railways were spreading in Europe, it was quite a long time before they began being built in Mexico, partly because of the terrain being so difficult. But of course, they had the incentive of transporting particularly valuable goods like silver and gold from the interior to the exterior. So that was a really important reason for them to undertake these journeys. Interestingly, I read in one source about them, the muleteers, obviously they would have a lot of mules under their control, but apparently they particularly liked to choose mules that were all roughly the same height, because this meant when they were in a long train, they would all walk with roughly the same gait and same stride and not bump into each other. So it was quite important that when a muleteer was looking for a new mule, that it fitted in terms of its heights with the other ones that he already had. Apparently often they also chose ones of a similar colour so they could identify their own mules more easily as well. And there's a nice picture, actually, painting one of a black mule being, I wouldn't exactly say cajoled, shall we say, persuaded to carry on its journey by some herreros who are having to give it a good shove to get it going. But as William says, they were vital to Mexico and vital in transporting goods around Mexico at that time. And in fact, somewhere I read that in parts of Portugal, I think it is, muleteers are still in use there in the cork forests, taking the cork out of the forests and plantations to be used, I suppose, in making corks for bottles of wine and flooring, or whatever cork is used for these days. It's less and less for bottles of wine, isn't it? But anyway, Apparently muleteers are still used, I suppose, obviously, because mules can get in between the trees nice and easily and bring the cork out of the forests. Apparently the muleteer had a thing called a cureta, which was like a short whip to keep the mules in check. But obviously they valued their animals greatly as they were their source of income. It says often more than their wives, which I suppose in financial terms would be understandable. Another thing I read about them is that they often had a money belt round their waist where they kept the coins with which they would be paying their clients and keeping their money. So I suppose they were quite a vulnerable target on the road. So no wonder they had guns and blunderbusses, as William says, to ward off any attacks. December 27th. From Maison del Refugio to Zacatecas is 6 leagues over a barren tract of country. We had now entered the mineral district, and nothing was to be seen on either hand but a few stunted bushes and the prickly nopal, a species of cactus plant. Nothing worth notice till we arrived at Guadalupe, a village about a league from Zacatecas. This place contains a fine large church and convent, but I must leave them for a future visit. Reached Zacatecas at 1 o'clock, and proceeded directly to the Mint, and was afterwards installed into my new apartments at the Casa del Cobre premises belonging to the Anglo Company. Afterwards, went and took my last dinner along with Mr. Manning, spent the evening pretty sociable, and retired early to rest. December 28th. Breakfasted with Mr. Penny, the director of the Mint, and spent the remainder of the day in looking over the premises and machinery, etc. December 31st. Close of the year. And now we get one of Will's poems. Years pass away like hours on time's quick stream. They are but bubbles, yet for ever signed. By the dark storm and by the sun's bright beam, by beauty and decay, marked too we find, by pain and agony and griefs that bind, man's spirit as a chain by joys that dwell, undimmed and pure in every thankful mind, by the glad meeting and sad farewell. W.S. 1843. So at this point in the journal, William writes a heading of 1844, and we get William's first entry for the year 1844. January 1st. Another year has dawned upon us, and with me in a strange and distant land. Last New Year's Day dawned upon me in the mighty metropolis of the British Empire, the headquarters of the civilization of the Old World. This one finds me on the Western continent, amongst a people different in language, in manners, interests, and in religion, a people, the lower classes of which are only as it were in a half-civilized state, the men without honesty and the women without the slightest feeling of modesty or delicacy about them, possessed of a country which for climate, fertility, and mineral riches has not its equal on the surface of the globe, yet they neither feel nor enjoy its blessings, leaving to strangers the working of their minds, and almost too lazy to till the ground for what is actually necessary for subsistence. A country that calls itself an independent republic, but which is nothing but a mere military despotism, and under which the most daring crimes are committed with impunity, and the very soldiers themselves, that ought to be the guardians of peace and order, are robbers on the highway. Such is the people amongst whom I am doomed to spend a considerable time, if it pleases divine providence to give me life and health. But I suppose I must put the best face on the matter, and rough through it as well as I am able. Took a ride this afternoon down to the village of Guadalupe, the day exceedingly fine and warm, the road from Zacatecas beautiful and level, and the favourite ride of the citizens. A salute of 101 guns was fired from the fort on this occasion. I'm going to break in here as William gives his little diatribe about what he thinks is in prospect for him in Mexico and his observations about the land and people. This is one of those moments when, unfortunately, his rather Western and rather bigoted British view comes to the fore. I mean, it's a bit rash of him to start making judgments about these people and the country when he's really only been there about a week or two. But aside from some of the rather unkind things he says about the people, bear in mind he also says this about Italians in general when he's in Italy. So he tends to, I would say, when he starts off in places, be rather judgmental. And I think over time his views change a little bit. I wouldn't say hugely, but they change a little bit to be a bit more sympathetic. I also think he's sort of painting this picture a little bit of being the civilised Englishman abroad kind of thing, amongst the natives. And there is this recurring theme where he comes back to say that the locals don't appreciate what they have here in such a great and fruitful and prosperous country, if only they could get organised enough and not be lazy to make the most of it. To be fair, he probably does have a reasonable point to say about the lawlessness of the country and the fact that it's a despotic state, because to some degree that was true with the likes of Santa Anna being in power. And it was really Mexico's political instability that led to its problems during this period of time. And indeed, its then entry into war with the United States on a footing really when it wasn't ideally prepared for fighting that war. And, if you're in a country where you've got to have a sword by your side and look out for bandits on the road who are very likely going to rob you, and if some of those bandits actually look like they're also soldiers in the army, then I can understand you being a little bit aggrieved and unimpressed by that sight. He's come from a pretty sophisticated land in Europe where no one was having to look out for bandits on the road and be aware of them to the degree that is obviously the case in Mexico, or having to arm themselves, which is obviously the case in Mexico. So I suppose that does create that impression. But it won't be the first and it won't be the last time when William makes comments that obviously are of their time and demonstrate this inherent, I would say, feeling of superiority over pretty well anybody else in the world, really, from a British perspective. The other thing I would say also is at this point, the journals are becoming much more contemporaneous than they have been up until this point. And that will be demonstrated also in the next couple of entries. So it's very much at this time when these events are happening much closer to the time when William is writing them. So there's a slight change in tone, I would say, and obviously intense and that sort of thing in how the journals are written. So from here on in, I think you could say it's reasonable to make the assumption that his entries that he's writing are pretty well on the same day as they've happened, or at least very close to it. January 6th, 12th day. Festival of the Epiphany of the Three Kings of Cologne. Rode up to San Clemente silver mine, the property of the Bolanos Company, and of which Mr. Penny is a director, as well as the mint. It is not a large establishment, but it is very productive, and the ore particularly rich and of the most beautiful appearance. There is no engine, the water and ore being drawn by horses, but they have a water wheel for crushing the ore. 6 p.m. After dinner I strolled to the plaza or marketplace, and seeing a great number of people proceeding towards the north part of the city, I joined my steps to the throng and proceeded along with them to see what was the matter. They proceeded to the Chapel of Jesus, situated just outside the town in a deep valley below the road leading to Fresnillo. When we arrived there, an immense body of people were assembled in front, some seated in groups on the sides of the mountains, some promenading in the valley below, whilst the chapel itself was crowded to excess. On the altar was placed an immense number of candles, and in a large space, one side of it was the representation of the Holy Family and the three Magi, or wise men, or the three kings of Cologne, who were presenting their gifts to the infant Jesus. Now there were no paintings, no statues, nor anything of that kind. The Mexicans won't do anything of this kind by halves. They go the whole hog and no mistake. Oh no, they were all alive and kicking, as the showman says, turning with disgust from the sight of so much bigotry and priestcraft that can dress up degraded human beings to assume the characters of so sacred a nature. I was making my escape to the door when a man in a most hideous mask and grotesque dress pushed a large pewter dish directly in my face and began soliciting money to assist in paying for this mummery. But I was not in a humour for anything of that kind, and proceeded at once back into the city. February 22nd. Met with an accident yesterday, but which I hope will not be attended with any serious consequences. In stepping down into one of the pits of the coining presses, the stool that the layer sits upon gave way under me, and I was precipitated to the bottom, receiving a violent strain in the groin. February 25th, Sunday. Took my usual Sunday morning ride to meditate amongst the mountains and solitary places. On this day at 1 o'clock, the sun shining brightly, I noticed the full moon in the clear azure sky as distinctly as I could have seen her at midnight. March 4th. Confined to my room from the effects of the accident of February the 21st. A considerable swelling of the groin having taken place, attended by a great deal of pain. Had 24 leeches on yesterday. March 11th. Still in a bad state. 24 more leeches yesterday. March 20th. A week back, a change had taken place for the better, but in the last few days suddenly became worse, attended by an excess of pain, the swelling increasing to a great extent. Had on 12 leeches yesterday at one time, and kept them on for 12 hours. April 9th. Considerably better, able to get about again. However, was under the necessity of administering Lynch law this morning. The boy, whom I have had some time as a servant, had been playing the thief. Having occasion to go yesterday afternoon to my portable desk in a hurry for some papers I wanted, I forgot to lock it, not thinking anything of the matter. I sent him up to the room in the evening with some earthenware I had been purchasing, when the young rascal, finding the desk open, took 10 out of 22 pieces of Mexican money I had there. In these cases we take the law into our own hands at once and lynch them, as the Yankees say. That is, give the party a sound horsewhipping and send them about their business. So I'll break in here, as this is one of those moments where, unfortunately, I'd have to say one isn't exactly proud of one's ancestors. I imagine when William says he dispensed Lynch law by giving the boy a good whipping, that did involve an actual whip and physical abuse. But there we are. It was tough times. It did just make me have a quick look into this term Lynch law. Obviously, these days we very much associate it with lynching of African Americans, primarily in the southern states of America, but it sort of evolved into that meaning as history went by. At the time William's talking about it, it was a more general term of just basically administering justice without the proper legal process. And there's two debated origins for the term Lynch law. I never knew this, but it's actually derived from a person called Lynch. And the two people the term is thought to have originated from is a William Lynch and a Charles Lynch. Now, William Lynch, who was a sort of guy in charge of a vigilante group in Virginia around 1780, and basically the idea that he was the origin of the name Lynch law was this group of vigilantes that he was in charge of would go round administering justice without going through the courts. The other possible origin is someone called Charles Lynch, again an American, again in Virginia, funnily enough. And his claim to the origin of the term is because during the American Revolution, he imprisoned, and I don't know whether he tortured, but he certainly imprisoned without due legal process Americans who were loyalists. In America, often referred to as Tories. Now, to a British person, that's just someone associated with the Conservative Party. But at that time of the American Revolution, the term Tories was applied to people who were Americans, but who were still loyal to Britain and still supported the cause of it being part of the British Empire. Anyway, this Charles Lynch, who was a Virginia planter, is thought to have imprisoned Tories or British loyalists at the time of the American Revolution against Britain. Sadly, as I say, as time went by, of course, it became much more associated with mob rule and black Americans being kidnapped by groups of whites and then horribly tortured and killed. But yeah, there we are. William is quite happy to give this young lad a bit of a beating, I suppose. As I say, times were tougher in those days. And you could sort of say it was a bit short-sighted of the young man in question to have stolen from his employer, considering he would have had a continuing job for certainly a considerable degree of time. So I would say it was a bit foolish of him to have stolen the money. The other thing I just thought I'd quickly talk about is earlier on in that section, William has this encounter with this ceremony revolving around the three kings, and he keeps talking about it being a mummery. This is, his usual anti-Catholic diatribe that feature throughout the journals. But I think what sort of struck me a little bit about this one was that, it describes it as a mummery and a ridiculous situation where people are dressed up as saints and religious icons, and this is so appalling for someone to do. But really, it's just a colourful way of the Mexicans celebrating Christianity in their own way, just by dressing up rather than it being paintings and sculptures and things like that. So from a modern perspective, it's very hard to see why he objects to it so much, really, because it's just another way of celebrating the event of the Three Kings. And I would say probably a more interesting, a more attractive and entertaining way, having people dressed up as biblical figures and so forth than, let's face it, a rather boring two-dimensional classical painting. But there we are. As I say, it's one of the times, and there will be more as we spend our time in Mexico, of William decrying the Catholic faith and the people who practice it, and particularly the priests who preach it. Also, just mention here, William has this accident, regrettably not very long after he started work at the Mint, and he says he hopes it doesn't lead to any serious trouble. As you'll hear in the next few entries, I'll talk about it more. It does have quite bad repercussions for him. April 25th. Suddenly worse. Been confined to my room again for the last 6 days, the swelling having become a fistula. Underwent the operation of cutting for it yesterday, which was very painful, but I feel much better today, the doctor having given his decided opinion that it will now be a radical cure. April 29th. Much better, able to get down to the Mint again, but feeling dreadfully weak from being kept on a low diet for so long a period, and what is still worse, a teetotaler at the same time. But still, there is something grateful and refreshing to get out again into the open air of this delightful climate, and I ought to be thankful to divine providence in bringing me through this pain and danger, and the kind friends he has raised up for me in this strange land. Mr. Penny, Mr. Hocking, a former director, and the latter the treasurer of the Mint, have been unceasing in their attentions, and Mr. Jenkins, the physician, has been unremitting in doing everything that he possibly could to alleviate the unfortunate situation in which I was placed. May 1st. During the confinement of several weeks in my room, I have had ample period for reflection and communion with my own mind, and though I know not how to account for it, the scenes of my earlier days have come with great force to my mind, conjuring up objects and associations which I have not thought of for years. This has set me to work amongst my papers and old letters, and having found a number of fugitive pieces, written at various times, to illustrate scenes in which I have mixed, it is my intention to insert them at various periods in this journal, where they may illustrate any particular day or bear any reference to anything that may come into the course of my observation. The following poem is illustrative of the manner in which May Day was celebrated in the north of England 30 years ago, but has now fallen entirely into disuse. The young lady who is mentioned emigrated with her parents to the United States more than 20 years ago, and now, curious as it may seem, I am an inhabitant of the same continent. And so then William includes this poem celebrating May Day. I sing the maypole and its rural cheer, the first-born frolic of the coming year, when smiling spring pours forth his genial showers, and decks the groves and meads in blooming flowers. The feathered songsters, singing blithe and gay, foretell the approach of that expecting day. The village maids salute it with a song, and bid it welcome all and wish it long. With eager haste they spread themselves around, and mirth, content, and happiness abound. The hospitable board they quickly fill, loud joyous shouts re-echo round the hill. Next then the dancers form upon the green, and old and young mix in the busy scene. There through the various mazes pass with ease, each being pleased because each strove to please. Such were the scenes familiar in my youth, of rustic virtue and untainted truth. Such were the sports that welcomed merry May, and made us happy as the livelong day. Such was my native village in its pride, a spot beloved o'er all the world beside. To me more dear, congenial to my heart, thy native charms than all the gloss of art. O fair Matilda, glorious was that day, when I was king and thou queen of the May. Yes, how we led the party on that morn, o'er copse and grave, and through each rugged thorn, and brushed the dew from the meadows fair, like young fawns bounding in the mountain air. Then quick returned, impatient of delay, anxious to mingle in the busy play. But long has passed that gay and happy tide, and we are parted far asunder wide. Thou too, like me, hast felt the hand of care, a far and distant exile is thy share. Across the Atlantic, forced alas to roam, and gone from all thy friends, thy native home. But thou, these scenes have long since passed away, and we are serious as we were once gay. Still shall remembrance cling to those bright days, still shall the poet's pen make known their praise. Yes, though a stranger now rules o'er the land that once beheld a Mowbray's liberal hand, and more, the house where first I drew my breath is levelled with the ground and cold in death. Sleep its loved owners, still my grateful heart reverts to former times, and loath to part, clings with delight to the dear sacred spot, in future life never, never to be forgot. Wareham, Norfolk, September 1832. Right, this is going to be the last point that I interrupt the journal. This is quite a sad moment, really, in the journals. Firstly, obviously, he spends quite a lot of time recovering from this injury that he suffered from when he fell off this stool going into one of the pits in the Mint, I think he says, because that happens on February the 22nd, and he doesn't really fully get over it until the beginning of May. So that's around 2 months where he's recovering from this accident. So he's obviously in reflective mood as well, reviving this poem that he wrote a fair while ago. I think he adds a few extra lines at the end about him and this fair Matilda having parted ways and now being on the other side of the world in the Americas. So this accident happens. He gets a large swelling in the groin, which becomes a fistula. Now, the term fistula, basically, it's a general term for any development in the body where two parts of it that wouldn't normally be connected do end up being connected. So it can be internally something like between the bladder and the bowel, or connections between various blood vessels that normally wouldn't be connected. Most commonly, it does seem to usually involve the downstairs area, shall we say, of the body. And sometimes it's brought about by infection or, as in this case, an accident, trauma. And basically, quite often it can happen where this connection goes directly to the outside of the body, to the skin, avoiding the normal route. So, not to put too crude a point in it, you end up having two areas where, for example, your waist might come out and stuff like that. And fistulas quite often seem to be linked to this part of the body. And obviously he's strained his groin area and it swells up. And he talks about all these hundreds of leeches that he has on the swelling to try and bring it down, which don't seem to be very effective. It's interesting in this period that leeches were being used so widely. Of course, they are still occasionally used today for this kind of reducing swelling and cleaning wounds and things like that. But obviously Will is in a period where they were used comprehensively. I think, does he say he had 12 dozen of them at one time? It's a hell of a lot of leeches stuck to your body. But anyway, it seems like the doctor eventually cures it by cutting into the thing and letting it bleed out, which is, even to this day, a way that they can be treated. But to me, I think the sad thing about it really is Will says just after it happens, I hope this has no long-term complications. I feel from my memory that although he does get better essentially and can continue his work and carries on living in Mexico for a little while longer and until 1848, I do feel that he never really fully gets over this incident and this injury, because he has then periods of ill health from time to time throughout the rest of the journal. And I think that they are all complications from this one incident. And as I said at the very beginning of these podcasts, the medical treatments and practices available to help people get over serious injuries really were nowhere near as good as they are now. And so this kind of incident did lead to people dying prematurely. I think these days they would be treated much better. If there was some sort of infection, that probably would have been cured and treated a lot quicker than they had then. They had no antibiotics to cure an infection like William obviously suffered from when he had this injury. So he's just relying on his body to get over it. And no doubt it may well have caused some sort of permanent damage. So for me, it's a rather sad event. And as I said before, he'd only really just started working at the mint. So it's a shame that it happens at such an early point at his time in Mexico. But at least he seems to have been surrounded by some caring people like Mr. Penny and the Dr. Jenkins, who treated him. So at least in that regard, he was well looked after by his fellow countrymen who were out there at the time with him. Right, that's the end of episode 49. I hope you have enjoyed listening to it. It's a little bit shorter than some of the previous episodes, but this felt like an ideal place to finish while William was now nearly recovered from the impact of this accident that he had. As I just said, I think it actually does have quite a significant effect on his health the rest of the time he's in Mexico. I also felt there was some nice colourful moments in it where he's discussing the mule trains that he sees, and also this colourful festival of the Three Kings as well, which he doesn't exactly enjoy or join in with the spirit of it. But there we are. Let's hope he gets a little less prudish as his time in Mexico continues. As I said before, if you do want to make contact with me, there's all those ways that you can do that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. So there's the Twitter account, Blue Sky, Facebook as well. If you Google a grand tour with my great-great-granddad, you will see these come up in the results. So hopefully that's a good way to converse with me if you would like to. In the next episode, William, he's still recovering from his injury, but he's beginning to start work in earnest. And he also begins to talk a little bit more about Zacatecas itself, which he says he hasn't really been able to see much of at this point because he's been mainly confined to his bed, recovering from his fistula. So it's an interesting moment now where William begins to, I suppose, talk a little bit more about his day-to-day work at the mint and inhabiting Zacatecas. So I'm going to sign off here. I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and as usual, if you have been, thanks for listening.